Welcome to the BPM 360 podcast. I'm Russell.
And I'm Caspar. And together we will help you navigate the treacherous waters of the BPM adoption journey. I hope you enjoy the podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the BPM 360 podcast. Russell, as always, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine, a bit disappointed. I was hoping to see you in person today. That
Yes.
didn't work out. Also, it's raining and it's miserable outside here in Germany. But besides that, I'm really happy to be here today, especially because we got a really high profile, interesting guest. So I did some research. I was super nervous. You know, it's like a third degree class guy, you know, getting prepared for some questionnaire with the teacher. So I was doing some research on this, and I'm super nervous, as you notice, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So
I can tell.
All good.
I thought I might help you by making it online then. Yeah, that's on me indeed. We were planning on doing this interview on site, and let me just introduce our guest. Today we have on the show Professor Doctor, and I probably missed a couple of titles, but Will van der Aalst. Will, welcome to the episode.
Happy to be here.
Oh, that's really great. Now, most of the people that are active in process management in BPM and certainly in process mining, they will know you. But just for the sake of all the listeners that we have, all of those thousands of listeners, sort of, they would like to know who you are. Could you just briefly give us a roundup of who Will van der Aalst is?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at RWTH Aachen University. I used to be for a very long time a professor in Eindhoven, but we moved to Germany like 7 years ago. I've also had various part-time jobs, working at the beginning for Bakkenist, which is now part of Deloitte, but still working, let's say, part-time for Fraunhofer, which is like an organization for the transfer of, let's say, scientific results. And of course, like a job that I enjoy very much is to be the chief scientist of Celonis, which kind of is very inspiring to, on the one hand, let's say, work on research and education-related things, and at the same time, also being able to influence reality and also see what the challenges are there.
Oh, absolutely. And it's wonderful to have you on the show. And I do remember that at the time that you were actually in Eindhoven, I was a student there. That's a little bit a while ago, but that's how I also got to know people like Hayo Reyes, who was also, I think, in your group at that time.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. Well, so...
But now you're talking about the previous century, right?
Absolutely. I graduated in 1999, actually. So right before the new millennium. Yeah, absolutely. So my first job actually was in IT at a bank. So you can imagine that when I joined them end of September 1999, that there was only one topic. The fortune I had was that they were pretty much done with the topic. And I could look at other things. So that was absolutely very nice. Right. Russell, let's get into this.
Absolutely. And just to jump into that topic around the process management and the chronicles and the how did you actually get to process management? And we've had a lot of different guests on the show, and it's been so interesting to see, say Caspar started off in a bank, and somehow landed up in process management, also in a chemical industry. I started off with chemistry, and then over some certain steps also came to process management. We've had clowns, we've had commanders in our show. Now, typically, I would say, with looking at, say, your educational background, maybe processes is near, but there's one aspect I think quite interesting. And I was talking to somebody at Merck not too long ago. He says, processes and data, they're two sides of the same medal. And I said, yes, but obviously people are always just looking at one side of the medal, and they stick together, but they never. It's like the ladies, what's it called, the moon and the sunshine. They're kind of like they belong together, but they never get to meet each other. So looking back at say your beginnings in this topic, how did you perceive this aspect of data and processes, and especially because you're an expert in process mining, how do you see this correlation between data and processes? As for a lot of us, it's like two different things, two different disciplines, two different sets of tools, two different like methodologies behind it. And how do you see this as a challenge to bring them together? And then how far did you also have to take a turning point in your career where you said processes or data, or did you always have in mind to keep this together?
Yeah, I think process mining is the technology to bring these two worlds together, right? And if you look at my background, it's perhaps a longer story, but I think we have the time for that.
We got time.
That would be like when I was still in high school, I was very interested in, let's say, computers, right? The first computers were there, and you could play with them. And then, like, I thought this is going to be very important. This is going to be big business. And then I thought, okay, I will not go to university. I will go to the Fachhochschule, the level below, because I want to do something very practical, and I'm sure this will be a huge business. But then, although my high school grades were exceptionally high, like the highest grades possible, there was like a lottery, right? So I could not enter the Fachhochschule, so the level below the university, which is a bit more practical. I was not accepted there, but I was accepted at university. So I thought, okay, but bad luck. So then I studied at university, and I did my bachelor's and master's together in, let's say, 4 years. And then I thought, okay, now it's time to go to industry and earn lots of money with this IT stuff. But I still had to do military service, right? At that point in time in the Netherlands.
Yeah, that was still there. Yeah.
So a very long story, but in the end, I started doing a PhD to try to escape army service.
Okay.
So it was not really a plan to end up in science, but then let's say after doing a PhD, I think some of the older listeners will still remember the workflow company COSA, right? After I finished my PhD, they also offered me a very nice job. And then I had to make a decision, like, what am I now going to do? And then I decided to stay in academia, and I think that was the right choice. So that was a bit like the career path. And if you look at the beginning of what I was very excited about was, let's say, process modeling, process analysis, simulation, etc., right? So I have a very, let's say, strong PetriNet background. I'm very interested in the theoretical aspects. And if you look at in my PhD, I was focusing more on, let's say, using PetriNet modeling for logistics processes, mostly simulation related, right? So where do you put stocks and stuff like that? And then I would say in the beginning of the 90s, you could see that this workflow management topic became very important, right? And in the mid 90s, I think there were hundreds of vendors selling workflow management technology. And I thought with my background in processes, this is like a beautiful technology to work on. So until that point in time, I was completely, let's say, process-centric, not data-centric at all.
Okay.
And then what I started to notice that there was big expectations, right? I also expected that any organization would just model their processes and then generate an information system that would support them. In hindsight, it was very naive, but what everybody was thinking at that point in time, including myself. But then I saw that it was not working, that many companies were buying workflow management solutions, tried to implement them, but I think also companies that actually bought the software then later often abandoned it. So this was the time of COSA, Staffware, and all of these tools. I think in many cases they were abandoned, and I got intrigued. Why is this, right? And then I realized, okay, in reality, processes are much more complicated than we like to think. right? If we make a flow chart or a Petri net, we draw something and we say, well, this is the way that it happens. But I think these workflow management systems often failed because they were modeling, let's say, the highways in a process, but not the more complicated cases.
Yeah.
And I think because of that, most of the work still had to be done outside of the system. And that triggered me to, so that was at the end of the 90s. Then I also got a new professorship, and I said, okay, in this new professorship, I want now to turn it around. And I want to start not from models, I want to start from what people are actually doing. This led to this problem, like in a scientific way. It is okay if I have a bunch of execution sequences of what has happened to, I don't know, an application or a patient or whatever thing you look at. I wanted to automatically construct a Petri net that would describe what was in the data, right? And that's still a super exciting scientific challenge. And that is actually like how the field of process mining started to exist. And I still remember that, so around the turn of the century, that I had this vision, right? This is completely logical, right? Let's not model, but let's try to analyze what people are doing, automatically discover things, etc. And I still remember I was at IBM, I was at IDS Share, I was at all of these companies, also in Silicon Valley, etc. And each time I would give a presentation of what we could do, people were super enthusiastic about it, that they would see it, but in the end they did nothing, right?
You were just ahead of your time, I guess.
That has always surprised me, but probably because customers were not asking about it, or they were thinking that it was not possible. And so that's how I got into this topic. And like in hindsight, you could say that I was also very lucky in a way that I started to work on this topic, and everybody said that I'm nuts. And I was basically with my group in Eindhoven. There were no other people working on this topic. But that allowed me to kind of, many of the key algorithms that I used in the field of process mining have been developed by me and my PhDs in Eindhoven. And that was just possible because like there was this decade that we were working on it and nobody else was working on it, right?
But just one question concerning the workflow, because you were saying that there was a bit naive about expecting the workflows in their simple happy flows to cover the complexity of real life situations. The BPMN modeling methodology is also, I think, a bit of an artifact from that time where you were thinking of formalizing the way to describe the processes that would be automated in such tools versus, let's say, EPC, which was clearly thought as like a modeling language for general like processes with a lot of manual steps or whatever. The question is, do you think also BPMN from that original motivation is also to a certain extent not naive, but some way maybe simplified or limiting companies in thinking beyond this, like say the pure happy flow and what they have in their model, and neglecting, say, the complexity that really is there by trying to squeeze it into this, let's say, simplified notation.
Yeah. So one has to realize that like BPMN is now the standard that many organizations are using, etc. But you have to realize that before BPMN, there were many like similar notations, like there were the EPCs, there are the UML activity diagrams, but there were also notations that were used before that people have forgotten about. So BPMN is in a way a consolidation of the mainstream thinking in things.
Yeah.
And I think where notations like BPMN, I think they are very much useful for discussion and stuff like that. But you have to realize that like if you look at the variability in processes, it is you cannot model this variability by hand, right? That you get models that look like spaghetti, what we find in mining. So you cannot handle variability. And one of the things I think is also the reason why workflow management technology failed. And I only realized that when doing process mining, was that if you have the BPMN model, you immediately start assuming, okay, I'm now following one case, right? And like I vividly remember that we were also analyzing, for example, the SAP reference model that you probably still remember, right?
Yeah.
There were so many errors in it. It didn't make any sense. Like many of the models had problems, but you could also see, for example, if you would look at the SAP reference model for how to hire people, some activities are talking about applicants applying application, and other activities are talking about the position itself. And it's put into the same diagram, but these are completely different things. And that made me also understand why, for example, in the context of SAP, workflow management was not very successful, right? SAP has developed several workflow management tools, and I think these workflow management tools were not necessarily bad, but they were kind of conflicting with this idea of SAP. Okay, you have a database and you try to keep that consistent and you run transactions on them, but the relationships between most of the tables are, let's say, one-to-many. Right? In one order, you have multiple items. A customer can have multiple orders.
Absolutely.
So, like if you look at the real data, you have, let's say, one-to-many relationships everywhere. And if you try to squeeze that into a BPMN model, right, that is kind of impossible. And I think that's also why, let's say, the breakthroughs that we are now at. So most of the research is now centering around, let's say, object-centric process mining, and that's based on this realization, right? That we are now at a point where we are getting more mature, right? We are no longer happy with this, let's say, two-dimensional picture of our processes. We want to look at these one-to-many relationships because they are very important to understand what is really going on.
And that makes a lot of sense because even as early as, let's say, 2015, when I was still working in the chemical manufacturing industry, we were implementing one of those first levels of mining on procure to pay, for instance, and also order to cash, by the way. And we would need to spend a lot of time in the configuration when we were stitching together all of the tables, because of this, let's say, even an N-on-M relationship that you often had between a purchase order line item which could have multiple goods receipts and multiple invoice items, and they would not necessarily correspond to each other. And that made it really difficult to create that whole logical process flow that would actually reflect reality. And that is something that was a big inadequacy, I would say, in the case-centric approach.
Just one, because I think that's quite this object-centric thinking around also process mining. In how far is that more or less similar, or not the same, but similar to the idea of in SAP looking at the document flow, where you're not just looking at, say, the single events of a case, but you're also always looking at, say, like the order and then the order positions, and then these are linked again against certain, like maybe twice document, and you have certain let's say events that will change the price, and that will then trigger then that the order has to be updated, and you have like these causal like connections that are somehow hidden in the data model of the SAP system. But there's a logical layer over it, how these relations and objects then stand in correlation to each other and react to certain events. Is it something like similar? Is it like analog, or is it like something that is more an abstract model that covers the document flow idea behind SAP, but goes beyond that because it's more an abstract model that can be extended beyond systems?
Yeah, so like I think it's the counterpart in the SAP system. At the same time, with many things in the SAP system, like the real concepts are a bit blurred and hidden. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree.
like when you start mining, you're also using things like change logs, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But just think about a classical BPMN model or a classical workflow management model. Then every activity that you see is always executed for a single thing, right? So if I make, I don't know, a BPMN model of a patient treatment process, then every activity, like the flow that you show, is just a flow of patients. You're not showing the flow of doctors or something like that, right? If you want to show the flow of doctors, you would need to make another diagram.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this classical view, okay, whenever we draw a process model, we are basically showing the life cycle of a single thing. That could be an order, that could be a patient, whatever, is not wrong, right? But we have to realize that it's a very limiting thing.
I was like cutting through the whole system and just picking out one line of one dedicated instance that you have actually artificially created. So like the instance when you join the events to create a case, it's artificially putting together events to have a certain view. That's true.
So for example, we could now say, okay, we have like a podcast activity event now happening, right? So we have an event podcast, right? And then we can say, okay, what is now the case, right? If we say the case is BPM 360, like the podcast series, right? Then this podcast is taking place only once, right? If we would model it, okay, there is every week, I don't know, a podcast being recorded. So there is a loop, but each time we execute that activity, one podcast is created. If we would now say, yeah, but we don't want to model like the podcast as the case identifier, we want to model the participants as the identifier. And then there is Caspar, there is Russell, there is Will. There are these three cases then. And then oddly enough, this podcast is taking place 3 times, right? Because if we now look at the flow, in the flow of Caspar it is happening, in the flow of Russell it is happening, in the flow of Will it is happening. So in reality it was one podcast, but if you start squeezing it into this case-oriented view, then you get these types of distortions. So often when I look at process models and there is some activity, then it makes a big difference. Are we now talking about items or orders, right? And often you see that people say that they talk about orders, but things have been replicated at the item level, so the frequencies don't make any sense. It's a bit technical, but it shows it shows that it is not wrong to have this view. But it's like just when you take a 2-dimensional picture of something, it's not wrong, right? You look at something from a certain angle, but there are certain distortions and certain things that you cannot see if you do that.
And I think that's a brilliant example, actually, because for 2 simple things. I mean, I remember that we had to do a lot of duplication from order level to item level to make sure that you could capture those relationships, but that would actually distort the numbers that you would get out of it.
Yeah.
And your illustration, I think the best illustration I saw from that 2-dimensional picture where you can draw a wrong conclusion is a picture that appeared in the British press of, I think it was Prince, not Charles, but his son. Is that Andrew or is it the other one? Which one is the first in line after Charles?
I'm not a king watcher.
Come on, Russell, you're British.
It's not Harry, is it? It's not Harry, it's the other one.
Oh, no, it's the other. So that's Andrew then.
Yeah.
Probably. Anyway, so he was pictured stepping out of a car, giving people the finger. But if you saw the photo from the other direction, it was just a hand, but it was from the other direction, it just looked like one finger. And then you go with the wrong conclusion. So if you have a 2-dimensional picture of something that is actually 3-dimensional, you're probably looking at it from a very limited point of view.
Yeah.
And
go
ahead, Russell.
No. So what I like, so the way you were explaining it with these like 3 podcasts happening from each of our perspective, it's like with the object-centric thinking around let's say the objects in an organization, you have like this multiverse of processes that are interacting with each other, and each has its own life cycle. especially when you go onto an instance level of, of creation till archiving. And on their journey through the multiverse of the organization, they are interacting with other objects and influencing their state. So I think I really like that. I love that picture. However, the challenge is if you had this as a model, like say, and I understand from also what I saw on say also in Celonis already, like this object-centric process mining, the way this object model is being built up, and if you had all the data behind it, aren't the tools currently? I see two challenges that the tools have in that perspective. First of all, I think you would have to work on one unified model across all use cases, where currently you have like a database for the process management, a database for the process mining, and maybe even some own separate system for enterprise architecture. To really make use of that, you would have to converge everything more around one unified, I would say, process model, like the real digital twin that follows this principle of multiverse. And the other thing is that you would have to get rid of the static way of modeling, and you would come to more like a dynamic way of defining. I want to see the extract of the life cycle of the podcast as a singularity across a certain life cycle with a beginning and an end, and based on the data, then produce this view. And be able to then dynamically change your perspective. It says, I want to see the life cycle of Russell's day today, where at some time there is an interaction with the life cycle of the podcast in itself. And I think that would really make a lot of sense. But there these two challenges of how can you get away from the static pushing things into man-made models, and creating more dynamic view on what is your question, what do you need to see, how do I need to slice and stop, let's say like a camera that has like a high shutter speed, and say for which angle and at which shutter speed do you want to have a look into the company at a certain time to be able to understand the context of what has happened there. But it's I think it sounds totally fascinating. But most probably something
to kind of respond to that. Like I think, like if we think about the classical way that we do process management and we talk about the process model, we always create a process model as like the main artifact, whether we are doing mining or modeling. And in a way, we know that it's just part of a bigger puzzle, right? Like interconnections, etc., etc. And I think the idea of object-centric process mining and also object-centric modeling would be that you don't do that you try to create this single source of truth. And I'm very much convinced that if you have a worldview where you say, okay, what is now relevant in an organization? These are objects, right? So that could be people, orders, items, even rooms, stuff like that. So you have the objects. You have the events that are happening, like an event podcast. There are, I don't know, 3 persons involved. There is a room involved, etc., etc. So I strongly feel that with this very general notion of objects and events and the relationships between these things, that is quite universal, right? It's very, of course, you can talk about continuous processes like the weather or something like that, but if you look at discrete processes, like in finance, in production, in logistics, this is a very general worldview where you really, I cannot think of examples where this doesn't fit.
Yeah.
The point is, of course, if you try to look at all of that at the same time, it is highly confusing, right? So you have this single source of truth, and then given the single source of truth, you need to dynamically create the views without distortions, or if you're flattening things, you have to know that there is a distortion based on demand. So you're kind of, first the process model was like the first thing, and that follows, but it has to reverse. You need to generate that on demand. And of course, what is now, I think that what we see is that things like mining and modeling and simulation, all of these things are converging But I would argue that process mining is ahead of these other domains, because if you would talk to people that are used to a classical BPMN tool and you would say them, this doesn't work, they would not know what to do. So perhaps for that audience, we will now have a period where we still need to generate this. What I also find interesting is that people that are new to the area, they think it's completely logical. People that have been working for a very long time in the area, they get confused because
Caspar and I had that discussion, and I said, Caspar, you're going to have to let go of certain paradigms that we just have in our head. And to a certain extent, although you have been exposed to process mining and process management from a very early time, and you've had both use cases, at your fingertips. But I think there's, and I completely agree. There's a lot of people that says, how can that's blasphemy. It's like it's blasphemy, saying that. But I can imagine that that for people just looking from it from a logical perspective, yes, that's this perception of the dynamics of objects in an organization, that makes not much more sense, but it makes absolute sense. Yeah.
So of course you have to acknowledge, like these flattened models, like in BPMN, etc. They are simpler to understand. But at the same time, everybody knows, okay, if I'm a company and I have difficulties supplying the things that have been ordered to my customers, right? I think everybody of us understands, the problem can be, I don't know, in sales, the problem can be in production, the problem can be in procurement, it can be in logistics. We kind of know that it can be in all of these areas, right? So if you really want to, with an open mind, look, okay, why can I now not deliver my customers in time? You need to open up your mind and look at all of these views. It doesn't mean that you need to look at all of them at the same time. I strongly think that you should generate these things on demand.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. But in order to be able to generate those views on demand, you need to have a proper understanding of the, let's say, the underlying meta model, which is, I think, what in object-centric process mining is called the object-centric data model. And I think that would one-on-one actually translate pretty well into process management, where you have one large model, and depending on the route that you choose to take from A to B through that model, that basically represents your dynamic view of an end-to-end process. So I think I completely agree with that convergence. Process management is trailing on mining in that perspective, for sure.
In your research, are you also looking into, say, new ways of let's say, dynamically producing this visualization, or even looking into VR technologies for having this more complex space visualized? Is this anything on your research agenda? Just because I've got my Quest 3 here, and I was just wondering if you have a cool application for me to a three-dimensional space of business objects.
Like that, there have been several attempts like that in the past, right? I think so I also have a part-time professorship at QUT in Brisbane.
Okay.
I think there we had an experiment like this, I don't know, probably like 15 years ago. That is when you get old. But the point is, and probably now it would work better, but I'm not so sure, right? So in general, I used to work a lot with Jack van Wijk, who is a visualization professor in Eindhoven, and he said 3D is really 2.5. Right? So you think you get the third dimension, but to view certain things, it is better to try to expose it into the so just look at something as simple as a bar chart, a 3D bar chart. You will have severe difficulties seeing what's going on.
That's
true. So sure, there will be applications and demos, etc. But I still see, as also talking to people, I think people see the gaming excitement aspect of it, But day-to-day usefulness, I think that classical visualizations are stronger. And like I think to make it very easy to end users, like these are, let's say, predefined views, right? If I'm in a company, then it's clear you do not want to look at all the complexity itself. But I don't know, if one manager has, I don't know, 10 dedicated views to look at the things where he's involved, right? I think that's the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one aspect is the maybe even the animation over time can be more helpful to see like trends and developments. So having like a dynamic develop, like flattened out model where you know which distortion or which slice you're actually looking at, and then having like animations around the time factor and how this develops in certain contexts is for the mind easier comprehensible than actually in an artificial three-dimensional world. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I understand.
So I think like going into that area, I think there are opportunities for things that can already be done today, but people are not really doing it. I think it's very easy to generate, let's say, process mining data into time series data. If you would like to look at trends, I think, of course, sometimes it's done, but I think there are way more opportunities there. I think there are also way more opportunities to do comparative process mining, right? I look at my process in January and I look at my process in February where I had all the problems. Let's now try to understand what is the reason.
Yeah.
I think from a technical point of view, all these things are there, but I think typically the people using these tools did not reach the level of maturity to think about it in these types of things. But I think there are ways with existing technology. I think there are many things possible that people do not think about typically.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And I think for me that's an interesting bridge. I mean, you now mentioned a couple of things, Will, that are technologically already possible. What I'm interested in is could you give us a bit of a peek into the future of, okay, so what are the next frontiers for process mining and maybe even for process intelligence in general that you see on the horizon right now? They might not even be yet on the research papers, but just give us
I'll just take my notebook so I can take notes on what I have to do, what I have to work on.
Like that's what people often ask, but I strongly have the feeling that although we learned a lot, we are still looking at the same problems as that I was like when I was starting to work on this on the late 90s. It was not really very different, and of course there have been, let's say, all kinds of let's say improvements. As I think, for example, something as simple as process discovery, right? The perfect process discovery algorithm. There are many process discovery algorithms available, many tools, but there is still progress in that area. If we now look at the combination of combining process mining with AI, right? 20 years ago, we were looking at, okay, can we now, if we look at the choice in a process, what is now influencing this choice? And we were generating and we were not calling it machine learning at the point in time. But it was exactly that. So these things are there. So I think we are gradually getting more mature, and there is definitely lots of advancements in things. But I often use the example of, let's say, self-driving cars. The first self-driving car, the first prototype was by Houdini, who was family of the Houdini,
oh really?
The escape artist, like 100 years ago, right? 100 years ago, people already had this vision of a self-driving car. And what they would have is that one car would drive after another car and it would be remote controlled, etc. So it was very simple. But this idea of a self-driving car is already 100 years old.
Oh, wow.
And like there have been lots of prototypes, and also in recent years there have been much of innovations. At the same time, it's very clear that although it is very clear where we want to go, we are not there yet, and there will be improvements. And like I'm, for example, very skeptical like about a self-driving car driving on some dirt road, etc., that is happening in the near future. But there are all of these, let's say, incremental improvements that make it better. And I see the same with, let's say, process management, that it will not be one thing, but it will be lots of, let's say, smaller innovations that will make that possible.
But just interestingly, that self-driving car will that always I always like that analogy. I'm skeptical about that, by the way, as well. I mean, I just got used to adaptive cruise control, which is just a very rudimentary form of giving some piece of control to the car. But the one thing that I believe will be very challenging for self-driving car, and then I'll make the analogy to the organization, is not the driving of the car. It's the responding to the things that are happening outside of the car and out of control of the car. And if you look at where the autonomous driving is being developed, like in the US, for instance, where there is a very different traffic situation if you compare it to, for instance, driving in Aachen or Cologne or, God forbid, in Rome or Amsterdam. I mean, that's so much different. And if you make that analogy to the organization, if you would envision a self-driving or autonomous organization, you need to take into account so many different things that are happening outside of your control. How are we ever going to take that in to the equation?
Yeah. But I think the way that you talk about it very well matches the ideas that I have. And so, like, if you look at like a self-driving car, there's lots of training material available, right? You can just drive a car on the road and you can learn, you can observe other cars, etc., etc. If you look at organizations, that is, of course, very different, right? It's not that that Google can drive around and can look in all SAP tables to see whether there are patterns that are repeating. So I think this is a big bottleneck, that in order to do that, this training material is not there, right? And, like the quantity of training material is very different. It's also very difficult to transfer, let's say, experiences in one organization to the next organization. They may have the same SAP system, but if one is producing cars and the other is producing soup or something like that.
But doesn't SAP Clean Core say, hey, these are the standard processes, just implement them? So here you have this, like I was saying, I think it's typical, let's say, European, that we're saying, yes, the world is complex, and look, we have traffic in Rome and Amsterdam. And America says we standardize. We have blocks, we have rectangles, we have stop signs. That's it. So by standardizing brutally, you can automate brutally. And so where is the balance there between individualism and trying to get control of things by standardizing? I think that's fundamental. So you could spend a lot of time thinking about all these exceptions, and you say, no, we just give out a policy to say there are no exceptions. This is the way we work. Both sides. The truth is in the middle, of course. Yeah.
But the thing that where I have hesitations, right? I think we will have cruise control for organizations, right? So I think that Caspar now feels confident. I think there will be cruise control mechanisms for organizations. But the moment that something like COVID happens or something like that, cruise control is switched off and you go to manual control. But what many people do not realize is that there is a fundamental limit to learning, right? The way that AI learns is by seeing many examples that are somehow transferable. And if I see in a sentence the word Trump, right? I see the word Trump in this sentence, then I can relate it to billions of other sentences where also the word Trump is appearing. And I have all of this knowledge, right? Now I look at a record in an SAP table. I don't know, I have dog food XYZ, so much quantity. How am I going to relate that? I don't know. All the other organizations, so I cannot look into the other organizations, but it's also not directly relatable. And the same is, we don't realize that, for example, how do these self-driving cars work? you can just provide it with many pictures, right? You feed it with many pictures, and in every picture you hide the part, and then you try, without looking at the part that you are having hidden, you try to learn it. So there is an infinite supply of learning material.
Yeah. And even
that's why I sometimes think that people are rather naive. That there are fundamental limits to learning. You need to have, let's say, way more examples than the number of degrees of freedom that you have.
And I heard something really interesting, because I mean, AI is a topic that is coming up in every episode nowadays and every podcast almost. Is I heard somebody say, listen, if you want to create a Western movie, so that around the US and the God knows when, back with cowboys and Indians, AI would be perfectly capable of doing that, because we have so many existing Western movies. But if you ask AI to come up with something that doesn't exist yet, it can't. And that is also coming back, Russell, to your remark on, yes, but in the US they standardize the routes, but it doesn't account for the other idiots on the road. Which makes it, and that's why I say Rome and
I heard
there's meant to be
there's meant to be a lot of them.
Yeah, but I mean, in Germany, they typically drive nice and disciplined and structured. That's different in Rome.
They drive 220 on the left-hand lane, and they drive 130 in the middle. And
that's
it.
At least you get to drive 220 in the left lane.
That's why I moved to Germany.
Well, I live 500 meters from the German border, Will, so I can be on the 46 really quickly. There's no speed limit there. I mean, I understand the limitations of learning, and I think organizations are complex, but I still want to challenge that a little bit. 60 to 70% of what an organization does is not core business. It's what I would call supporting processes, and they are pretty much the same for everybody. For that part, you might go a little bit further in your autonomous organization or your cruise control for an organization, but in the core business, that's going to be quite difficult.
Yeah, but then the question is, like for these standard things, you probably already know how to do it, right? And then it's
you should.
That perhaps a more normative approach would make a lot of sense. But of course, always when you say something like that, you really need to look at the data, because I think all of us have the feeling that sometimes we are in a standard process, and in the end,
I know where this is going,
right? That I could give you many examples. Earlier we were talking about my last name, Van der Aalst, right? How many exceptions that is generating, but I'm sure that I'm somewhere in a flow that nobody ever imagined that would be possible.
And it's interesting to see how also on the process documentation side, when people do get down into the details and they start reflecting on all the, let's say, exceptions or cases they've had, how this, let's say, this repository does start growing, and it's very hard to differentiate. So is this really relevant? And a lot of the times there are relevant cases there, but I'm not sure if it's relevant to have them documented in that form. That's where I think the dynamic, let's say, development or identification of these cases, data-driven, that's something where you say these are the cases we have. However, there we still have the challenge a lot of the time interpreting, putting the context to it. So differentiating between this case, you see the variance that you have. Sometimes, if you take the process man, you look at all the variants that you have, and sometimes it's astonishing how certain combination of events create an own variant that could be aggregated with another one. Because there's certain events in there, certain event sequences that are not relevant to identify the case, the context of which it is there. So I think here, I would hope, I don't know, the technologies on certain, let's say, applications I've seen or cases I've seen, they haven't been quite there to guide the people in aggregating and identifying relevant cases versus non-relevant cases and helping them put it into the right context. And I think that's where we're maybe with the brink of maybe also with the help of machine learning, but also maybe with this context of having a bigger object-oriented meta model to help understand the context, that will be more than just a small incremental change in how we can use this data. Because here I think there is still a lot of gray zone where I think there is, with a bit of this combination of like say approaches, this could be a breakthrough, because I think this is a real limitation. You're still so dependent on experts being able to read the events and aggregate them and put them in context and get them there. And it's hard to get these people that really have this analytical depth of understanding the data model, the business model, the processes, and then the output of these tools. Yeah, so I think that's where a big potential is.
Yeah, but I feel like we often use the 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of the cases can be handled by a relatively straightforward process, right? That you can also like automate. The remaining 20% has these kind of exceptions or the things that you did not think about, or that also often are triggered by, let's say, gaps between different organizations. And like to do this remaining 20%, I think if you try to squeeze this remaining 20% again in the 80% of the process, that will often not work. Of course, there are variants that are completely unnecessary, right? Which are just habits that you should get rid of. But I think like it's best to go to a model where like the things that can be handled automatically and are clear are handled. But for the others, that you have like more hybrid intelligence where humans are in the loop and that also really try to look at that. And I think if you look at many processes, it is still so that they are either paper-based, very labor-intensive, stupid work in a way, or they try to completely automate it. But this kind of more hybrid way of trying to do certain things that are standard in the standard way, and this other part by more specialists, that will probably also make like it will lift the level of work, right?
Yeah. So taking away the standard commodity and then leaving the decision-taking complex exceptions for people then to deal with. Yeah. And have like case managers taking on the case. I think that's an approach that is, that's seen as there's something to move forward on. Yeah.
Cool. Hey, Russell and Will, I think we got time for one more question. If you have one, Russell, because I need to always be the timekeeper, Will, and I take my role seriously. So we need to start to wrap it up, unfortunately, as I feel that we could talk for hours on this. Russell, any last things that you're dying to know from Will?
I had some questions on the list. I think they're going to open up a Pandora box of discussions. We should
maybe we do a second follow-up down the road.
I'll just give a hint on it. I'll give a hint on it, but this is not a question we want to dive into. I was going to dive into on this diversity, because we've had a lot of guests around, say, talking about enterprise architecture versus BPM. Yeah.
Oh God,
we've talked about process management and process mining, and I really like the way we've covered the aspects of these two medals, where you really represent a person that has not looked at either this side or this side, but have really, over the many decades, have actually always been covering both and looking at them both in combination with each other, which I thought was really awesome today. So that question I still had on mind, I said, we could go down this rabbit hole at some time. We're not going to cover. So ultimately, I don't really have. Ich habe keine Frage.
Keine Frage mehr. Okay, gut. In that case, I think the question then, Will, would be, if we ever go down that rabbit hole, would you be up to go with that rabbit hole with us some other time down the road in a follow-on episode?
Yeah, so sure. We were talking about, it's now Friday afternoon, right? So,
yeah.
It's a good way to close the week.
Oh man, absolutely wonderful. It has been a pleasure, Will. Thank you very much for making the time for us today, and maybe also in the future. It is a good time of the week to do it. I wish you a very pleasant weekend. You too, of course, Russell. And thanks for joining us, and thank you for listening, and take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Will.